Welcome back to part 3 of our video lecture discussion, week 3 of COM 2113, Communication, Media Culture, and Social Influence. We're finishing up some questions from Simone, and Isel is on deck with some challenging inquiries about our readings. Bouncing off of the Roberts text, Kathleen Glenish Roberts was editor of an anthology of applicable media analysis essays, Communication Theory and Millennial Popular Culture. Isel writes, as a discipline and theoretical body, semiotics concerns itself with the study of symbolic construction of meaning, page 85. Does Roberts mean that semiotics is more like a second language? Please explain. Okay, so yes, semiotics we can understand as well, in terms of a second language. I think we can recognize that languages are distinct sets of signs and symbols. So language itself is comprised of signs and symbols, and thus, to be bilingual, to be trilingual, is to pick up different variant languages. And even though we typically divide those based on maybe a cultural background, sometimes a geographical background, right? English, French, Spanish, just to name a few, among so many other languages, and how we typically divide them based on maybe cultural heritage, countries, these types of political borders. There are different languages that we all share or could be separated by. And I think an important aspect of the pedagogy of the communication media and ethics major is that we are using what is becoming a universal or global language, and that is the language of popular culture. And so as texts, as storytelling, as ideas become popularized and then shared, consumed, celebrated, not only at a national level, but at an international level, as these texts gain influence, social influence, and popularity, and create a lot of commerce, right? Both in the words and the ideas we share, but also the exchange of commodities, of goods and services. This tells us that popular culture is a unifying language, but it's not entirely unifying, because we can find just as many people who may be familiar with one artifact, right, that we could quote unquote define as popular culture, but not be familiar with another dozen, okay? And so that is where pop culture can become a slippery terrain. That is where signs and symbols do take on additional added meaning and values, especially if they're brought into that kind of cultural discussion. Our book, The Berger Text Messages, also talks about a litany of both rhetorical minds or semioticians in conversation with one another. One is Saussure. Saussure transformed linguistic inquiry by saying that human language is arbitrary signs or words that bear no direct relationship to the things they designate, but acquire meaning through a conventional understanding within the community, from page 86. What does Saussure mean by arbitrary signs bear no direct relationship? Do these signs or words, must they be independently interpreted? So back to this first question, essentially, what does the theorist mean by arbitrary signs bear no direct relationship? Here's an important takeaway when we think about language in general. Single words, a word by itself, with virtually no exceptions. We're not going to get to the full semantics, but single words in their essence hold no meaning unless we pair them in conversation with other words. right? And so you have to have the combination, the interrelationship between words and terms for the key words to then be activated or to make sense, to have that symbolic meaning or value. Does that make sense? So we have to understand things in congregation with one another. This helps explain an aspect of our course that some of you have challenged early on, right? This idea of why study what's with the spy genre, or why study a single genre, or why write about this text as opposed to my favorite text. And the response, right? The goal here is to understand that by studying one thing together in conversation, by breaking it down and assessing its ingredients, its small parts, we start to pick up on the language of how that thing operates, or rather, the language of how that thing communicates. How does a spy text communicate? How does it communicate a worldview? How does it communicate social status? How does it communicate inequality? How does a spy text, how does the spy genre communicate or articulate ideas of gender, of power, of violence? Okay? And then what do these symbolic readings or meanings say about the society they reflect? And so that, hopefully that's a little bit of an unpacking to demonstrate the potency that we get when we can study literary texts, or when we can understand that process of how metaphor or allegory or myth or storytelling work, right? They work as a fiction, but they help shape the real world in certain types of ways. All right, that's very exciting. Roberts says the power of a sign, so the Roberts book, the power of a sign is related to people's investment in it, on page 88. What did Roberts mean by people's investment in it? What is it, right? When Roberts is referring to the people's investment in a sign, what we're talking about there is what a sign means to us, what ideas or values or pleasures or beliefs signs and symbols provide us, right? So when we talk about investment, a sign can be highly loaded or encoded with meanings and values to one person and then be completely devoid of that to another. And so maybe this is the difference between, say a couple's going out on a date to the movies, and one time they go to a rom-com, because I've referenced rom-coms, right? Romantic comedies earlier in this lecture series. And it has a lot of shared meaning, right? A couple early in a relationship, right? They're in these throes of perhaps romance, that sort of thing. Comedy, lighthearted. This enables that process of, they're in a real life process of coming together. And so the genre reflects some of those values, some of those hurdles, some of those challenges, and sort of the humorous qualities, the added suspense of where it's going to go, and so on. And so they might be on the same page there. Whereas, let's say the same couple, they go to an alternative movie, all right? And it's a genre that one person thinks a lot of. Should we say a spy genre picture? Is that too niche for this audience? And let's say the other person has no interest, right? So person B, no interest in spy genre. Person A, interest in spy genre. And so for person A, they have familiarity, they have background, they're being rewarded by the symbols and symbol systems. Oh, covert missions and gadgets and action sequences, whether realistic or hyper-real or whatever, fantastical. And so they're getting lots of sub-pleasures out of the text. Okay? Oh, they're getting an adrenaline rush, right? And so on and so on. They're seeing homages or callbacks, meta texts buried in the text about previous aspects of the spy form, right? Formulas, conventions, tropes, and so on. Meanwhile, the other person is not up to date in the spy genre, so they might be enjoying it because they're with, pleasant company, but none of these meanings are registering, and so the experience of performing the ritual of going to the movies may satisfy them in some way, but it's not necessarily giving them deep gratification because they're not necessarily appreciating the minutia of the genre. All right, and so that not only answers or at least gives us a response to Ezel's inquiry here, but that gets at a question that was asked earlier by one of our classmates about Juanita, I believe, about what it adds to go into a certain generic product with preconceived notions of it. Okay. Chris asks a question, and we're going to wrap this up shortly and perhaps give one last callback in part 4 form here in a little bit. Chris asks, looking at Berger's messages. Berger, okay, there's a quotation that thus long hair in men is used to signify artistic, end quote, from page 53. And Chris asks, how does this change? How does long hair look artistic then? And it being fashionable, and yet you could also look at someone like a truck driver with long hair and have a more repulsed reading of that person, right? It's not necessarily signaling artistic, right, or fashionable in that sense. And maybe with that, the fashion of a truck driver. I think the important thing to consider here is the role culture plays, right? Hence our course's term, cultural influence. Fashion, style, these kinds of things. There's a reason we call a lot of these qualities fads, right? They come and they go. There is a season for them, and then it leaves. Some ideas stay longer, some depart sooner. Okay, and so fashion's a weird business like that. And style is a weird business like that. So what we want to think about is what's important to consider is how a subculture frames certain aspects about society, right? Something like long hair on a man. And so in the artistic community, there might be something more expressive there, right? It could symbolize, and talk about semiotics, it could symbolize a kind of, in touch, unbridled by standards of masculinity, right? Common society says, Western society says, trim your hair, keep your hair trimmed, shave your face, right? That sort of thing. Whereas the artistic side is more liberated, right? It's free. I'm going to grow my hair long, right? It's an extension of my artistic expression and so on. Reverse side of that, right? The trucker says, let's say I've got more of an edge to me, right? I'm a person that occupies status on the margins of society, right? And so I don't conform to white collar expectations. I don't make millions of dollars in banking or whatever. I drive a truck, right? And so I put a ball cap onto my hair and I don't worry about cutting it or shaving. And so these are two different expressions of masculinity, but they're also projecting something about, social status, okay? And so there's social influence there that can play a role in that. Follow-up question, really quick. This doesn't have a particular page, but the Bond films have him, being intimate with women. Is this supposed to be a semiotic way of telling us that he's an alpha male? Yes. Absolutely. Bond is portraying that alpha male. And there's interesting, I would say, that's an interesting reason why sometimes American audiences, they identify with that, and then they could simultaneously resist it, even if they view themselves as alpha males. Because, sometimes like those competing bucks, right? ramming horns and stuff. Anyway, we'll be back to conclude our video discussion shortly.